Just a minute. Good. Okay, comrades, welcome to the meeting of the Workers' International Network. Today we're discussing the upheavals in the Middle East, but concentrating or focusing this time on the event in Syria, which has been quite a major event. It's always a pleasure to see dictators fleeing countries for their lives. We've already seen two of them at least this year, and they're periodic events. And it's always something to a particular source of pleasure and enjoyment to see them running for their lives. This in this case particularly, it's after 13 years of the most savage civil war, and it's a civil war that actually dates back to the outbreak of revolution in 2011. It follows the Arab Spring, which spread like wildfire across the whole of the region, and and in the case of Syria, it led to a particularly bloodthirsty repression. So the fall of Assad is the consequence of quite world-shaking upheavals throughout the entire region. And of course, finally brought to a conclusion by the redrawing of the map in the Middle East as a result of the Israel-Gaza war, which has affected, of course, the effects of which, or the reverberations of which, have gone far beyond Gaza. They also affect the West Bank, Lebanon, and Syria. And the only thing that we have to say, with the regret that we need to say, to express in relation to the departure of Assad, is that it was not through a popular uprising, as in most of the cases that I referred to before. And it's particularly bizarre to see the USA and Israel apparently welcoming the victory of a group that was at least up until recently, if not now, allied to Al Qaeda and to ISIS. It's one of these more strange kind of convulsions of the area. So, what are the consequences? And we're very happy to welcome Comrade Matthew, who's going to give us an introduction to this very complicated subject. Hoping to keep it to about 20-25 minutes at the outside. And then, of course, we welcome all contributions and questions from everyone. So, Comrade Matthew, over to you.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Yeah, I'm going to show you a bunch of maps of Syria as an effort to try and explain where we're at. I mean, what Roger said is right. I mean, what we're seeing, obviously, interestingly, in the collapse of the Assad regime is the end of a particular tendency within the Arab world, effectively Arab nationalism, which I mean whose real sort of figurehead is Nasser. Assad, of course, comes from a similar party, the Ba'ath Arab Socialist Party, certainly of Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, because of course, dictatorship is a family business. But what you're also seeing, of course, is the rise of some other political tendencies. The interesting thing, of course, the first one, of course, is the Muslim Brotherhood, which originates in Egypt, runs through Gaza. The dominant faction in Gaza, of course, is Hamas, which is essentially the Gazan and etc. And now extensively on the West Bank as well. Faction of the Muslim Brotherhood. Even Erdogan in Turkey is associated, his movement associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. The other bunch of people you're seeing the rise of course, is what are called in the West the jihadist factions, the likes of Al Qaeda, ISIS, and the Taliban. Of course, I mean, what they're known locally in the Middle East as is the Takfiri factions, because jihad just means struggle. You know, there's jihad can be anything, and the Takfiris are more specific than that. I mean, effectively, what they say is that they can designate groups as apostates, and therefore they're giving them religious permission to go and kill people en masse, which of course is useful to a lot of people. The other significant thing about the Takfiris, of course, is what Taliban, which we won't deal with, was set up by the ISI, the Pakistani intelligence service. Al Qaeda, of course, is associated and always has been with the CIA, and numbers of people have said, as you should know, have said that the CIA has a long-term arrangement with ISIS as well. Which you do tend to believe, given the source. Anyway, so I'll go through this series of maps and then do a certain amount of the history of the regime. Right now, if I go and do this, yeah, okay. So this is Sykes-Picot, because obviously Syria is the product of imperialism. Its boundaries are drawn by imperialism. This is the original arrangement as they carved up the Ottoman Empire between the French and the British, with the agreement of the Russians. There was even a position, actually, they had an arrangement with the Italians, that the Italians would get a piece of Anatolia as well, which is now Turkey, of course. And you know, all of that collapsed. We have this, of course, down to our dear friend Lenin, who, of course, come this 1917 revolution, they said we will publish all the secret treaties, and this was one of the major products, as they published the Sykes-Picot Agreement, much to the annoyance of the British and the French, and the outrage of the Arabs, of course. And what you can see, obviously, is the line is quite different, is somewhat different to the Syrian border, with the French to the north and the British to the south. But yeah, it's close, reasonably close. So it's basically a line drawn with a pencil in the sand, with no acknowledgement of anybody who actually lives there, and a division also, of course, of the Ottoman province, which at the time included all of Syria and Palestine, etc. So, I mean, you know, in those terms, and of course Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon, of course, and Syria are intimately linked. I mean, effectively, really, they can't be socially separated. I mean, you know, again, I mean, the boundaries are ridiculous in those terms. You know, a product of imperialism and the efforts of the French to create enclaves for their own benefit, and you know, obviously to give something to the Christian Maronite community in Lebanon in particular. So to move on from this, I'm hoping it will actually work. Come on. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so if we look at what bits of Syria actually look like, obviously you've got white area, which is effectively desert, and then you've got this patchwork of different communities, which you know made up, and obviously lines of borders which take very little acknowledgement of who actually lives there, or their relation to each other, etc., because they're drawn somewhere else. These boundaries for Syria were drawn in 1920 from somewhere else. So the important things to note here really is obviously that you've got three significant groups, particularly what in the east you have the Kurds. Obviously, we're also stretching to Turkey, hence the Turkish interest in the whole piece as well, because obviously the Kurds are the one people who really did very badly out of the imperialist redivision of the Middle East, because they got nothing. You have on the coast in the west, you have the Alawites, because obviously you have we'll go through this in a minute in terms of religious terms, the Alawite community and so on, which is central to the whole governance of Syria. And in the south, you have the Druze, again, important in terms of both Lebanon and Syria, and into obviously the occupied Golan Heights. If we look at it by religion, obviously the bulk of religious terms is Sunni. You do have, as I say, the Alawite sect in the west on the coast. And of course, you also have, of course, some of the original Christian communities. You know, the oldest Christian communities on Earth who've been there from the start in some areas, and of course, very old Jewish communities as well. I mean, the tradition, of course, the cities of the Middle East, the major cities of the Middle East, have had Jewish communities, including Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, and so on. And the efforts of the Zionists, of course, post 1947, were to try and remove those communities by various means. Even bomb attacks and so on and so forth by the Zionists themselves. So very as I say, deeply divided in those terms set of communities, but obviously people living together generally and have done for thousands of years. Islam, of course, is syncretic and has numerous different tendencies within it, as well as the major split between Shia and Sunni. And you have things like, you have sects like, notably the Alevi in Turkey, who actually are the prime source of the cadre of the left in Turkey, which is the largest left in the region. If you look at it by language again, you can see there's a big split. Much of it Arabic, but Kurdish is the second largest language, and numerous other minor languages, including Aramaic, which is the language that was spoken apparently by Jesus. It's very old and interesting language. What we're now seeing, of course, is the intervention of the imperialists. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw in a few maps in terms of the intervention of the imperialists in Syria, as it existed as at the middle of last year, just as an out, so you can see why we wind up where we are at the moment. This is the US, which is critical. I mean, obviously, there's if you look at the south on just by the Iraq border with Iraq, and also close to the border with Jordan, there's the key Al Tanf base, which is the main illegal base of the Americans. It's actually near opposite another base in Jordan called Tower 22, which was attacked by during the Gaza genocide by quite an ingenious drone attack. But you can see that the other focus of the Americans is in the east and their alliance with the Kurds. And of course, the fact that they have seized, the main oil province, which is around Dal al-Zar in the middle there. And that has been critical in terms of undermining the main source of income historically for over the certainly the post-Second World War period in Syria has been oil. And the Americans under Trump seized that. And actually, interesting enough, that most of that province had been seized previously to ISIS, and the process of processing that oil usually means it goes to Turkey, and some of it has been discovered goes by a roundabout route to Israel. So in that sense, the people of Syria are being doubly ripped off. If we look at then another imperialist force, the Turks, we can see obviously the Turks are most interested in the northern side of their own border with Turkey and opposing the Kurds, because obviously their prime reason for being involved is to keep the Kurds out and to prevent the rise, the rise of the Kurds and the associated movement of the PKK in Turkey itself, the YPG in Syria. Centrally, if you look at the sort of the little northern lump at the top of the map, there's a town called Kobane, which has been fought over quite extensively by the Kurds and the Turks and the agencies of the Turks. They've created the Syrian, what's called the Syrian National Army. So you can see the sectionalization of that. The final bit which is also important in terms of in historic and tactic and strategic terms, is the Russian bases. I mean, there are other maps of this. I mean, there's also like there's a map of Iranian bases and so on and so forth, but it just takes too long. The Russians, in Russian terms, this is extremely important for them strategically. This is their only real base in the Mediterranean. They have an air base just south of Latakia, which is huge, and has actually played an important role in maintaining Assad in power over a whole series of certainly since 2012. They also have, as I say, their only naval base in the Mediterranean at Tartus, and they have actually been active all over the country, backing the regime. What this has meant, of course, with all these forces on the ground and actually backing proxies, all of which are basically confronting each other in one way or another, had to be some quite extraordinary dance manoeuvres in order to prevent outright confrontation between, say, the Russians and the Americans, or the Turkish and the Americans, both of whom are backing completely opposite forces, or indeed the Israelis and the Russians, because effectively the Russians have controlled Syrian airspace, which has, of course, then extensively been entered by and violated by the Israelis. So there's been this dance between the different powers as to who gets where when, so they don't come across each other or start shooting at each other. And that's been going on for at least the last decade. So yeah, as I say, this is further on the Russians' important bases, and the result of the fall of Assad, of course, is the possibility that the Russians could lose these key bases. They've actually been filmed removing key assets from their airbase just south of Latakia there. So it's not clear, and they're negotiating to stay there if they possibly can. These final two maps are to cover really the bits of who controls what. So what you're seeing is a multi-way split. The Syria now, of course, is essentially another failed state. I mean, obviously, the invasion of Iraq, or the double invasion of Iraq, winding up in the fall of Saddam, has destroyed Iraq as a state. This process that's taken place after the Syrian uprising of 2012 and the steady collapse of the regime has now rendered Syria into at least 4 or 5 pieces. And so what we're seeing here is the red. Red is the forces of HTS, which is the force led by what was the local affiliate of Al Qaeda, supported particularly by the Turks. The eastern side is the Kurds, supported by the Americans. Although, of course, I mean, if you were a Kurd, you would not be at all sanguine about how long the Americans, or what would cause the Americans to stop doing that. The northern strip, as you can see, is the Turks, is the SNA, the Turkish SNA, the Syrian National Army, as they try to push back on the Kurds in particular. And in the south, the orange piece basically is a series of forces, particularly including the Druze. Druze are, Druze are a fairly interesting group. They actually, as I particularly concentrated around Golan and into Lebanon. There are villages in the occupied, the Israeli side of the occupied, or the piece of Syria occupied by Israel, who say they are Syrian. They're not interested in. They won't acknowledge the occupation. There are other Druze within Israel itself who actually are the only Arabs who serve in the IDF. And again, obviously, you've then got the Walid Jumblat's group in Lebanon. So it's quite a split. But out of this, they've arrived at that piece of Syria around Deraa. And well, there are other forces there, but they're the strongest as far as I can see. if we look at the closer piece of Damascus, I mean, the thing is, obviously, you've got, as I say, the piece around Deraa, and then, of course, the IDF has then entered Syria, entered the Syrian side of the piece of the Golan Heights they hadn't occupied, and they've occupied the whole of Mount Hermon, which is the highest point of the heights. And that map doesn't really reflect how far north they have got. They've got within, I mean, I've seen that they've got within 40 or even closer kilometers to Damascus itself. The reaction of HTS, of course, and the relationship between that, between the Al Qaeda elements and Israel has always been very cordial, and said, well, that's fine. That's we don't mind if they occupy part of our country. I can't see that staying around. I mean, particularly obviously, as I say, given the effectively the IDF has been defeated in Gaza. I mean, the leader of HTS, Al Golani, of course, actually his family actually come from Golan. Why he want his ancestral part of the world occupied by the Israelis, who can tell. Although he did declare, interestingly enough, when his forces captured Damascus after the fall of the regime, his nom de guerre is Al Jolani or Al Golani, and he said, well, my real name is Al Shara, which it is, but the tribe to which Al Shara pertains, obviously that's a tribal name. They said, no, he's not one of ours. He can get lost. So you can see that the mass of people are not overly happy with this, and rightly so. Anyway, so I think that having said that, in terms as an outline of where we stand in terms of the state of Syria and its divisions, I think it's also to say something about the al-Assad regime. I mean, the al-Assad regime is interesting because it is, based on the Ba'ath Socialist Party, the Syrian section, the Ba'ath Socialist Party, the Iraq section was, of course, wound up being led by Saddam Hussein, who was a CIA man. The al-Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, of course, interestingly, he came from the Air Force, and you can the regime itself, of course, as the imperial, as a the leadership of a country subject to imperialism, has always tried to face in numerous different directions. However, you can Assad himself, of course, had a record of particularly of opposing the Palestinians. One of the things he was noted for, just before he staged a coup to come to power at the end of 1970, was to effectively support Black September, the crushing of the Palestinian Fedayeen in Jordan. There was actually a division of the Syrian army present in Jordan at the time, supporting the Fedayeen, and he, as head of the Air Force, refused to support it. He refused to have his aircraft fly in support of it, and which meant the crushing of the Palestinian Fedayeen and their expulsion to Lebanon. So seizes power in the back end of 1970. Essentially takes over from his own party. Actually, I mean, it was factional battle within the Ba'ath, and essentially what happens is that the country becomes an ally, particularly of the Soviet Union. The economy is in large part nationalized. It becomes obviously dependent, particularly on oil, and you can see, the process, the up and down of the Syrian society is dependent on the oil price. I mean, despite the fact that it's not got a particularly large oil reservoir, that's the main source of income. At the same time, you're looking at a move by Assad himself to basing the whole thing on the Alawite community. So that coastal community as where he's drawn from as being, you know, his base of power, and they then take essentially the power within within the regime, and that's, you know, the effect we're going to see is that the fall of that power base, and the, you know,
Matthew,
arrival
just
of
to
the
tell you,
attack theories.
Matthew, you've had 20 minutes, so I'm not
Okay,
trying
all
to
right,
cut you short, just letting you know, okay?
yeah. Okay, so I think the other thing, the other point to make in, you know, in terms of is the arrival also of the change, the shift that happens when we see the arrival of Hafiz al-Assad's son to take his place in the family business when Assad Senior dies in 2000. See, Bashar, of course, is an accidental dictator. His elder brother Basil was the actual intended inheritor, but he was killed in a car crash. Bashar was a doctor. He was an ophthalmologist practicing in London, which is why he's got a British wife. So, you know, he was going to be quite, you know, quite happy serving the masses in London until he was called back to the family business as a matter of urgency. So the thing is that then, of course, the nature of the regime changes. Obviously, with the fall of the Soviet Union, we then see a move towards neoliberalism, towards the privatization of everything of the Syrian system. We see the cooperation. I mean, sorry, prior to that, of course, the Syrians actually supported the Iranians against the Iraqis, because obviously their prime loathing was Saddam, so they supported the Iranians against the Iraqis in the Iran-Iraq war. They then actually supported the invasion of Iraq. The first Gulf War in 1991, there was actually Syrian soldiers involved in it. They did not support the expulsion, the downfall, the second Gulf War. They didn't support that. However, of course, what they did was they played their part in the war on terror. They had a deal. I mean, there was a deal effectively between the Syrian regime and the CIA. The CIA, of course, basically operated a series of national subcontractors. And the saying of the CIA was, well, if you wanted somebody interrogated, you sent them to Jordan. If you wanted them tortured, you sent them to Syria. If you just didn't want to see them again, you sent them to Egypt. So, you know, there was that division. So what you then see is the condition of that, you know, 2011. There's then of course the eruption of the revolt, which is quickly then itself subverted by again the CIA, because obviously the thing is that the CIA runs. Obama runs this Operation Timber Sycamore, what's called Timber Sycamore, which supplies billions of dollars to its favoured Takfiri rebels in Syria. So the likes of our friend Mr. Giuliani, who actually starts off as the deputy to ISIS, moves to Al Qaeda, sets up Al Nusra Front. He gets a whole pile of money from the Americans to run that, and then of course he gets trained by the Americans, followed by the Turks, followed by the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians actually provided a certain amount of assistance, obviously as a means of having to go at the Russians as well. So in those terms, we now see that's coming to a head in the collapse of the regime. I mean, clearly, you know, under conditions in which the Syrian regime was one of the most sanctioned on earth. I think the third most sanctioned country, or third most sanctioned regime on earth. Their main supply of income, oil, been removed. Their actual operation, you know, is a sort of, you know, this oligarchy relatively small oligarchy around the al-Assad regime. The main source of income was manufacturing the drug Captagon, which they did in enormous quantities and exported it throughout the Middle East, and that was what kept the thing running. The army, of course, was not being paid very well. I mean, they were paying, a handful of dollars a month. So essentially, you can understand why, under conditions in which you have an assault, the army just says, right, okay, we've had enough, we're off. What it does is it opens it. There's the two things then happen. One, of course, the Israelis staged an enormous series of bombing raids, one of the biggest set of bombing, not covered by the media in the imperialist West, as usual, because they've basically been reduced to a third-rate propaganda service. Is a vast series of bombing raids in which they destroy all the military infrastructure of the Syrian army, such as they can see it, which is most of it. And they flatten everything and drop some vast numbers of amount of bombs. They advance forward up to Damascus. You now have a situation in which, as I say, you've got essentially a three-way confrontation between the Turks, the Americans, and possibly even there's now discussion in terms of, is there going to be a confrontation directly or indirectly between the Turks and the Israelis? So it is an extremely volatile situation. I could say more about the horrors of Syrian politics, but I will leave it there, and comrades can come in and make contribution, ask questions.
Oh, well, thank you, Matthew. That's amazing encyclopedic knowledge of the history and the political implications of it. Really, thank you very much. Right, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions as well as contributions to the discussion. Who wants to go first? Form an orderly queue, please. Well, just to kick it off. Oh, Finn, are you asking to come? Do you want to come in now? You're muted, Finn.
Yeah, I was waiting, Roger, to see if the other comers want to speak, but like yourself, I decided I'd indicate. I want to thank Matthew for a very detailed presentation with information that wouldn't be readily available. So I want to add a couple of points of my own to just stimulate some aspects of the discussion. I think we need to focus a bit more on what's happening to Syrians within Syria. All the points are correct, about the Turkish intervention, the US intervention, the Israeli intervention, all of that is accurate and correct that it's raised. We need to look a bit more perhaps at Syrians and what's happening among Syrians. The first thing I want to say is that the overthrow of Assad was a major victory. We've got to stress that, irrespective of the implications and the interventions by others, it was a major victory for the population of Syria. And the intervention of foreign powers are opportunists, no more than you'd expect. So Israel, the US, and particularly Turkey have different ambitions for the territory, but that's not a major surprise. The important thing to look at is what's the way in which the Syrian population can react in such a way as to preserve the gains of the revolutionary overthrow of Assad. Even though it didn't arise from mass movement or solely from mass movements on the street, although we can see them now. The celebrations of Syrians now shows what could have happened if there was a mobilization. The relief and the expressed happiness of people that Assad is gone is an indication that it could have been a mass uprising. And as it happened, he fled, he went. As Matthew explained, the underpaid army just melted away, left in some cases weaponry and even their uniforms on the streets, just to leave the whole army experience behind. The origins of the conflicts that Matthew was explained in the maps need to be looked at perhaps a bit more closely. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, which you've explained, is very much it's a central issue in the entire Middle Eastern region, where countries were handed out by agreement, principally to France and Britain, the Mesopotamia to Britain, which became, or three provinces were united by Britain to create the state of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon given to the French, and the French then exploited religious divisions within these countries. The Christian minority were given Lebanon, which was taken from the kind of great, what was then known as Greater Syria, a coastal region, and it became a Christian outpost that the French were able to use. And the most extreme example of that division was in the massacre in the Sabra and Shatila camps during the invasion, during the war in Lebanon in 1982, where the Israeli army surrounded the PLO camps. This was a determination by Israel to destroy the PLO. So the IDF surrounded the camps and then allowed the Phalangists, which was a fascist group which arose from the French exploitation of the Christian population at the time. They massacred the population of the refugee camps in full view of the IDF. And that was so bad a massacre that even in Israel itself, there were mass demonstrations in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And of course, Sharon, who was the Minister for Defense at the time, resigned or was kicked out of his position. Now, he later, of course, became Prime Minister and was responsible for the continuation of the war. But at that time, the opposition to that massacre was such that there were demonstrations throughout Israel. I raise that point because it shows the exploitation of the religious divisions, which was fomented by the French. The Alawite minority, which constituted about 10 or 15% of Syria, 80% being Sunni, the Alawite minority conducted a regime in the interests of that minority. It's a Shiite sect. The Druze also is a Muslim sect, and they also had influence throughout Syria. So that minority excluded the 80% Sunni majority in Syria. And that lay at the base of a lot of the opposition to the regime, the exclusion of the Sunni majority. And that makes it easier for the likes of HTS and Gilani or Shabbat, whatever he wants to call himself, to then raise support. But maybe we should look a bit more closely at what they're now saying, the Gilani's group, the HTS, are now saying. There were al-Nusri, that's what they began as a jihadist. Well, I understand Matthew's distinction about the word jihad, but jihadist really means Islamic fundamentalist groups in our understanding of the thing, even though there are differences in the way the word is interpreted. So when we refer to jihadist groups, we're talking about fundamental militaristic groups of people who were driven by Islam and the return to the time of the prophets and stuff like that. But even if that's how Gilani began and the HTS began, and for a while they controlled the region in the north of Syria, and they had industries, administration, welfare systems. So there's quite a bit of control up there. There was some opposition in the way in which they raised taxes, but they did control the Idlib, or a section, an area in Idlib, and they were funded and supported by Turkey, similarly, who have their own ambitions. But that doesn't diminish the fact that they were popular in that region. But when they marched on towards Damascus, or when they advanced towards Damascus, there was hardly any resistance, which shows the mass support for the movement. So we need to put maybe a bit more emphasis on these aspects, that it was a mass uprising, although not along traditional lines, which began back in 2011, as Roger indicated and Matthew indicated, during the Arab Spring, as it became known. And then what became known as the Civil War, the Syrian Civil War, was in effect just a clampdown by Assad on the people who were committed to the demands of the 2011 uprising across the Arab countries. I want to say a word about the Ba'ath Party, which has a unique presence in that area, Syria in particular, and maybe it needs a bit more kind of focus. Firstly, it was a pan-Arabic movement, Arabist movement initially. And the aim was to unite not just Iraq and Syria, but Egypt and other. I mean, the idea is a progressive idea, but it couldn't work under a capitalist system because of all the other ethnic, tribal, and religious divisions across the region. So unless it was based on a socialist perspective, it wasn't going to succeed. But the idea behind it was, a progressive type of idea. It didn't last long, a couple of years. Iraq and Syria came together, then Iraq pulled out. As you said, Saddam Hussein became the Ba'ath leader in Iraq. The movement in Syria is a bit more interesting because the Ba'ath Party appealed largely, or was composed largely, of junior army officers and a kind of middle class urban elite. And that group had a certain kind of class consciousness. Now, it wasn't a working class movement, but they did use the term socialist. They did call themselves the Ba'ath Socialist Party. They did nationalize a lot of property, they introduced welfare reforms and other reforms across the country. And they had also amongst the membership ex-members of the Syrian Communist Party. And bearing in mind that Iraq banned the Communist Party because the Ba'ath in Iraq wanted to control everything from the center, whereas there's a bit more of a tradition of sustaining socialist and communist movement in Syria. That's a bit of background. Then, of course, the army, there was a division in the Ba'ath, as Matthew alluded to, between the civilian, if you like, section and the military section. And the military section became dominant. And they were involved in a series of coups. The first coup that Hafiz al-Assad was involved with, even though he wasn't the leader of it, was in 1963. And there was a succession of coups. And eventually, there was the coup which brought Hafiz to power as a leader. And then the massive repression began. And even though the party had some kind of a history in revolutionary and socialist kind of thinking, from that point on, Assad then exploited religious and sectarian divisions within the country, creating divisions rather than allow opposition to develop. There was a massive clampdown. There were tens of thousands killed in a particular demonstration in one of the cities of Syria. Then, when his son Bashar took over, there was a massive clampdown, like hundreds of thousands killed, many, many thousands imprisoned, torture. 6 million people emigrated from Syria, and a further 6 million were displaced internally. And that massive clampdown was the background for the uprising now, today. That's where the support comes from. And you could see in the celebrations on the streets, as I said earlier, the relief people felt, the downfall of Assad. Now, I made these general points, and Matcha has made a very interesting, very useful, valuable contribution. I'd like to hear maybe some discussion about the implications within Syria, amongst the Syrian population. I don't think the US will have any significant gains from it. Israel wants to get territory because it's an expansionist settler colonialist regime anyway. But in addition to wanting territory, they want to be able to, whenever they feel like it, move in and attack any military threats that they might see coming from the north to north of Israel. I don't think they're going to make an awful lot of gains within Syria in territorial terms. America won't last. Russia was already starting to pull out of Syria when the recent events began. And something else we should recognize is that the victory or the overthrow of Assad was a major defeat for Russia and a major defeat for Iran as well on a world scale. Bashar al-Assad turned towards Iran sometime after the 1979 uprising and identified himself with the Iranian regime, such as Matthew explained in the Iran-Iraq War and other events. So he associates himself with the Iranian regime. Again, there's a religious link there, which goes back to the ethnic and religious divisions which imperialism created. So they're just a few general points that I'd like to throw in and maybe listen to some discussion. And I'd like to hear if comrades have information about what's happening within Syria. Like, as opposed to listening to Jelani. Jelani says he's abandoned all his Al-Qaeda and all that. There's no way of knowing whether that's going to happen or not. I mean, if somebody says that, they say that. We judge by what we can see on the ground. He didn't impose, he's not attempting to impose an Islamic perspective on Syrian society, and he says, we'll judge by his actions. that he's in favor of the freedom for women. He doesn't want to impose restrictions on women and so on. So maybe a little bit of discussion of that might help us to understand the perspective where we're going. But for the moment, it's a very positive development, and we need to cling to that aspect.
Oh, thank you, Finn. That's provided very good supplementary information and relevant questions. Ian.
Hi, thanks. I'd like to strongly disagree with some of what Finn said. I think some of it was very helpful, but specifically the issue about it being a victory in any way for anything positive or a positive development, I'd strongly disagree with. I think it was possibly the only major victory in this genocide that Netanyahu has had, and his backer, bloody Biden. That in all of his proxy wars, this is the most spectacular achievement in the dog days of his presidency. And from it have flown other negative consequences. In Lebanon, they got the guy that America and former colonial power France, now Jelani, Saudi Arabia had all been pushing for president for a 2-year standoff, finally installed. He was the leader of the army that didn't fight back at all against the Israeli invasion of his country. He's appointed a prime minister who seemed surprisingly positive, the Chief Justice of the ICJ that had found Israel guilty of a plausible genocide. That seemed surprisingly positive, but then it turns out, well, he's left the ICJ, so his deputy's taken over for the next 2.5 years. She was the only judge, and this includes the Israeli mandatory observer on the court, who found with Israel, the Israeli government, on absolutely everything. Even the Israeli guy, the former Chief Justice of Israel, found against Israel on ordering aid to get in, whereas this new president of the ICJ found against even that. So it's quite a chess move in some ways to have him there, though hopefully he'll at least be a more positive Prime Minister of Lebanon than we might have thought coming out of it. But on the world scale, they've been able to parlay this victory into other victories, despite facing defeat in the main theatre in Gaza. And I think, yes, the fall of Assad, but what's replacing Assad? We'd all say that French imperialism in 1940 was a bad thing. But when the Stalinists in the Pact era welcomed the Wehrmacht to Paris, saying, "You've overthrown French imperialism," that was complete madness, as was the third period after Hitler us perspective. I think this Jolani HTS current is fascistic. Finn mentioned the Phalange, and of course these religious sectarian hatreds don't always run just one way, with one religious group, the Christians or the Alawites, being the baddies, and then the Sunni majority are therefore the goodies. Divide and rule means both sides having their bands of reactionaries, and certainly in this case, they're like a Sunni Muslim version of the Phalange, maybe even of the Stern Gang and the Irgun back in the day, overrunning a country. Hopefully it won't last as long as that, but that's where they've came from. I don't think they had a popular base in Idlib. Idlib was the unfortunate area that all of these gangs that had been causing havoc across Syria, many of them foreigners from all over, were moved to in the various agreements that froze the conflict around 2020. There were actually a lot of discontent with them in Idlib in the last year before the big breakout. And I don't see it as a popular uprising at this stage. There's definitely a popular uprising in 2011, 2012, degenerated into a civil war. I think one of the problems was there was mass support for both sides. There was obviously a lot of legitimate grievances with the dictatorship after 40 years of the Assads, but there was also a lot of popular support for his what they saw as resistance. We could debate that, but saw as a more resistant Arab state than any of the others to Israel. It came soon after the Lebanon War in 2006. He was seen as the linchpin of this axis of resistance. Of course, I don't think that Syria should just be seen as part of a chessboard and the Syrian people don't matter, but there was also the fact that what the opposition, the militarily dominant part that emerged of the opposition quite soon after the initial clampdown had to offer the Syrian people was worse, was more sectarianism from a previously, as Matthew said, very diverse society, the oldest Christian community, the language of Jesus, Shia minorities, the Druze and the Alawites coming out of Shiism. I mean, just so you can be for the majority in different ways. Sunni majority, 80%, all right, that's like the black majority in South Africa, but also like the white majority in Britain. And Elon Musk's dad compared Tommy Robinson to Nelson Mandela in the week. Absolutely disgusting comment. And I'd purport that Jolani's more Tommy Robinson than Nelson Mandela. The Sunnis weren't systematically excluded. Most of the Syrian Arab army that did fight against these groups for the last dozen or so years were Sunni. Obviously, not being paid, the hollowing out of the state in the last period, they didn't put up a fight, and neither did the foreign supporters. But this was a major strategic victory for Netanyahu. It would be the equivalent of a defeat at Alamein or Stalingrad in World War II, for example, for the Allies. We wouldn't celebrate that based on disagreements with Stalinism or with colonialism in North Africa, for that matter. It's not been enough to stop Israel eventually, it seems, by Donald Trump doing things Biden wouldn't, being forced to agree the deal that was on the table for the best part of a year in Gaza. But it was a major step forward. They've annexed 3 times the territory, or occupied, probably soon to be annexed 3 times the territory of the Gaza Strip. Jolani said that they're not going to fight back, even though it's his ancestral home. It is interesting, his origin. He actually seems to come from quite a good Arab nationalist, secular background. His dad was a left-wing dissident, an Asserist under the Baathists. And perhaps like Liz Truss in this country, he should go home and learn something. Hopefully he'll last as long as that. Maybe he's already lasted longer, but hopefully it won't last for a very long time, because it is a very scary situation where we could see the carnival of reaction of a partition where you get a greater Israel now banning Muslim religious services and the like, and monocultural Muslim majoritarian Syria, where, yes, he's making some of the right noises in defense of minorities, but as Finn did say, don't judge him by what he says, but by what happens on the ground. And there's been a lot of mob violence against the religious minorities and against women and secular people. So it's a scary situation where I think his moderation will more be about appeasing Israel, appeasing the Western powers, not fighting back when his own country's invaded, let alone showing solidarity with the Palestinians. And then the red meat to the base will be letting them attack minorities at home. And if he actually does try and clamp down on attacks on minorities, then we might see forces worse than him swooping in if he alienates the extremist base that are the main armed force in the country too much, with pockets of ISIS still around and so on. So it's a very, and he's said that he won't hold elections for 3 years. He's clearly the leader of the country, but he's not got any official government post. But his official title is Emir of HTS, so he's effectively the monarch of the country. So it's a very bad situation. Another thing is that out of all these anti-imperialist resistance, whatever you want to call it, states, rogue states, whatever different terms are used, Syria was the one that the incoming administration trumped to an extent when he, correctly, I think, in his inimical style, but pointed at what was going on when he said Hillary and Obama founded ISIS way back in his first campaign in 2015. And even more than him, his incoming spy chief, Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who actually broke with the mainstream of the Democrat Party, endorsed Sanders in 2016, ran herself in some ways to the left of Sanders in 2020, and then endorsed Trump this time. She actually missed the inauguration of Trump previously because she was meeting Assad. And although she denies this, there's all sorts of rumors that she was being a diplomatic bridge between Trump and Assad. She certainly was a lonely voice in Congress against America's funding of a proxy war by all these militias. That it's a really bizarre thing. Are the exact kind of people who also attacked America on 9/11, having been previously supported the first time in Afghanistan. So that kind of, and sometimes for bad reasons, for Islamophobia in the Trump camp, but at least a consistent, we don't want to support Al-Qaeda as opposed to we'll support them here, but then we'll promote Islamophobia at home of the real deep state. This is where Trump, not being of the deep state, could be a positive, even though he's obviously of the right. If Syria had still been there, if it had held on for one and a bit more months, then who knows what would have happened. But now it's gone, and Israel attacking Islamist militias in Syria and stealing more Syrian territory on those pretexts will obviously not be such a hard case for Trump. So it's very bad in that way as well, and possibly the reason Biden rushed it through when he did. Because I get that it's not Joe Biden waved a magic wand. I get that, but I think the idea that this happened one day after the ceasefire in Lebanon is not a complete coincidence either. There must have been coordination. Things are coming out about Turkey building links between the different opposition groups before they launch their attacks too. So it's not simply something that's internal to the country, even if it can't all be explained by external forces. For example, the fact that the regime was hollowed out and turned out to be ripe for the plucking. But that doesn't mean it was a great popular movement. It was more like a blitzkrieg with the masses absent from the situation, and hopefully now starting to come back into contention with resistance on the streets to the new leadership. I don't think this was just the fall of a dictator, but the rise of a worse one. And I think we have to focus now on solidarity with the Syrian people against al-Shara, Trolani, whatever he wants to call himself.
All right. Thank you, Ian. It's not often we get controversy, and it's a very welcome thing. But we're looking at the same events, and probably no differences on actually the forces at work. But the outcome is still unclear. But I think we should remember the quote from Spinoza that I think Trotsky used to use, which is our task is neither to laugh nor to cry, but to understand. And I think looking at it from both angles, as we've done in this discussion, is a very welcome and positive thing. Charles, welcome you to the discussion.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, everyone. This has been a very powerful discussion. Ian jumping in, expressing a lot of the concerns that we face, especially over here in the States, where the discussion is dominated by those that are often referred to as tankies and often called Assad apologists. We haven't really in this discussion yet put this in the context of the inter-imperialist conflict in the world, even though the maps were very clear in showing the proxy nature and the centrality of Syria. So thank you, Matthew, for really helping take a look at that breakdown and the the standoff, kind of like at the OK Corral right before everybody pulls the trigger. And obviously triggers have been pulled for a long time. A number of issues. I've gone back to this Lenin quote from 1916. It's about 4 or 5 paragraphs. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm sure you're all familiar with it. He says, whoever expects a pure social revolution will never live to see it. Such persons pay lip service to revolution without understanding what revolution is. And he goes on about the backwardness of the petty bourgeoisie and the masses being thrown into the revolt. And this really comes down to the question that he was raising, is how do we build a revolutionary party to overcome the backwardness of the classes involved? Some of the issues about I think can be dismissed that Ian raised about Jelani, and I'm not going to be his defender, because right now what we want to defend is the arms in the hands of the masses, and it's not sure if Jelani is trying to take those arms out of the hands of the masses or not. But in terms of responding to Israel coming in and not taking up arms against them, well, we've seen Assad for decades just allowing Israel its place in the Golan Heights and standing by and not taking up arms against them. So I think what we see here, and then in terms of the masses, yes, it was a military blitzkrieg. I don't deny that, and at the same time, we know 6 million of the population are refugees across Europe and Asia. Where are the militants? Many of them are dead. Many of them were prisoned. Many of the families are suffering and cannot fill up the ranks of the revolution or build their revolutionary movement. I was on a plane in Damascus one time, and we're just about to take off, and this is just anecdotal, but of course the secret police came on and dragged somebody off. What do I know? I knew nothing about who it was, but I'd never seen that anywhere else that I've traveled, and I'm not a great traveler of the world, but it was surprising what I saw. And so this is not just a debate on the left. It's a question of how we respond to the unfolding of the uncompleted tasks of the Arab National Democratic Revolution. There are many who are even denying now the Arab Spring was an aspect of the Arab Revolution that's uncompleted. Most of us here are Trotskyists, and we understand that those tasks cannot be completed without going over into permanent revolution and extending past borders. And this is all a part of the acceleration of the inter-imperialist struggle, the necessity of building a new international and a working class leadership that can participate and win over the masses who are driven into revolutionary uprisings, despite the backward consciousness and the various and sundry prejudices and holdovers from our consciousness under oppression and imperialism. And so that's my comment. The task is really to build a revolutionary party everywhere, to extend the National Democratic Revolution to the permanent revolution. And you can all read the Lenin quote yourselves. I'm not going to go any further. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Charles. Right, who's next? Or maybe, if nobody else wants to come in, maybe Finn and/or Matthew would like to make a comment. Oh, sorry, Dominic.
No, it's John who wants to speak. It's just that I can't do it electronically. Don't you?
Right, John,
Yeah.
welcome.
Just want to make a few points that we are living through a period of turmoil as far as Syria is concerned. in many ways, it's probably like early 1917, that there are all sorts of factions, some with good intent, some with bad intent, and there are all sorts of movements. For instance, with the Bolsheviks, they were accused of being German spies, and at one period were almost forced underground. But eventually they came out because they were echoing the real wishes of the Russian people: land, peace, and bread. The position is one that history is littered with people who say one thing and mean another. To many Irish people, the simple thing about the Battle of the Boyne was that there was Catholics fighting Protestants, and in the best traditions of Catholicism, the Pope was on the side of the Catholics. Nothing could be further from the truth. As far as the Pope was concerned, he was at war with France. France was on the side of Catholic King James, and therefore, if Catholic King James and the Catholic Irish were massacred at the Boyne or Aughrim or other battles of that period, well and good. And it's the same with the Middle East now. The major area that has absolutely deserted the Palestinians is the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and the other Gulf states. Because why? Because they hate the Muslim Brotherhood. They hate any challenge to their power. Again, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, their leadership over the last 30 years has played some very bad hands. The first Iraq war was against Iraq for its invasion of, what do you call it? Of Kuwait. And the Palestinian leadership backed Saddam Hussein against the monarchy in Kuwait. And as far as the West and as far as the oligarchs and feudal rulers of the Middle East were concerned, that was a mortal sin that would never be forgiven. Again, in Syria at the moment, we have people saying things, and at the end of the day, what they say will be, to use, I think, a thing that Engels used to use, is that the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Gilani and other people may say that they're in favour of a secular democratic republic in Syria, and maybe even a secular democratic socialist republic in Syria. But that will be played out. The only thing that I can see that has real, if you like, traction at the moment is that the majority of the Syrian people do not want to go down the path of either Libya or Afghanistan, that they want to see a country where, if you like, religious and other divisions are put to one side, and that they want to see a country that's united. As far as the Syrian diaspora is concerned, there seems to be what I'd call positive hesitancy about returning to Syria. They want to see what they're returning to, whether they can make anything of it. Because from what you can see on the television, is that the Syrian and Russian air forces did to Syria what the Israeli Air Force has done to Gaza. They've flattened whole areas of the country. They've displaced many tens of thousands, in fact, millions of people. And I think myself, to label what is happening at the moment as being a triumph for Islamists or not, I think is totally premature. And I think myself, it's not, a great thing to say wait and see, but I think it's a matter of trying to give what support we can, which is probably very limited, to those who want to see a united Syria based on, if you like, a secular society where divisions either of gender or tribalism or religion are put to one side and the needs of the whole population are put to the fore. And I just feel myself that that is important, because history is littered with, rogues who've said one thing and done another. The speaker who talked about the OK Corral, I think, brings it to mind that the Earp family were put over as great saviours of law and order in the West. And from what I can gather, they were a set of rogues who were out to make as much money for themselves as they could. And law and order was a way of perhaps lining their own pockets. So I'll leave it at that, comrades.
Yeah, thank you, John. Interesting points. Finn, do you want to come back?
Yeah, just briefly, I think it's useful to explore all of these points because we don't have the answers. We can't see the future. So we have to explore. I think the overthrow of Assad in itself is an issue to note. If we look at what are the possibilities coming behind it, you end up in all kinds of knots, kind of mental yoga where you could give yourself an injury. So we need to be careful not to be trying to anticipate. For example, I'll take this illustration, the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The Shah was overthrown by a mass movement in the case of the Shah. And at the end of the process, Khomeini came back from Paris and the Shiites were in power. But between these two events, between the downfall of the Shah and the coming to power of Khomeini, there were countless opportunities for the left in Iran to take control of the revolution. There was a strong Communist Party, the Tudeh. There were strong trade unions and a strong tradition of trade union action. So that's the point I would make in relation to Syria. The gap in Iran between the downfall of the Shah and the coming to power of the Khomeini and the Shiite clerical regime, there were opportunities presented again and again and again. And if we were to say, and that's a long time ago, but if we were to say, well, what's the point in overthrowing the Shah because there's other fuckers going to come back from Paris and we're going to be in a worse situation. And it's probably true to say, actually, probably is true to say that the regime under Khomeini, for a lot of people, not for everybody, for a lot of people, was worse because of the, first of all, mass executions carried out by by Khomeini, and then the repression. But the victory of 79 is what needs to be examined, and also the opportunities. But then there's one or two general points though, which there is no solution to this question other than socialism. And we don't always spell it out, but this time we have to. There's no solution because of the ethnic, tribal, national, and religious divisions that exist. Similarly, there's no solution to the issue of Syria without including also other countries such as Iraq, Lebanon, and right across the Middle East. There needs to be a unity, not in the sense that like the Arab armies in World War I and T.E. Lawrence and the Hashemite dynasties, not that kind of a unity and handing over to the Saudi family in the peninsula, power, not that kind of a unity. The unity needs to be based on a common program of solving problems of living standards, of public service, of allowing for religious divisions, allowing for all kinds of national minority rights and so on. And then to unite the population. And by the way, that must include Israel, because we don't hear much now about Israeli working class, but Israel is a class divided society also. There's a stronger, I understand from stuff I've read recently, a bigger class divide in Israel between the rich and the poor than in many, many countries. It's one of the most divided in terms of class. But what the ruling regime in Israel does is they allow for all kinds of religious ideas to come to the forefront to confuse that. They give land and housing to the people who are now called settlers because a lot of them can't afford to get property or to rent property in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. So the government says, listen, lads, go and take this land off the Arabs. You can live there and we'll give you special subsidies and you can grow your own produce and set up industries and solve the problems of that. So Israel must also be included in this socialist federation of the Middle East, a united movement for socialism and for independence and for all this thing to be linked to class issues. I think we can give too much emphasis to inter-imperialist rivalry as well. We need to be maybe a bit vigilant about that. There'll always be, as there is today, inter-imperialist rivalry. Now, not in the same way as existed, say, prior to World War One, or for that matter, World War Two. There is rivalry, and we can't describe events or analyze events in the context of what the imperialist powers want to achieve. We can't attribute the seizure of power or the overthrow of power in terms of what the CIA wishes to achieve or what Mossad wishes to achieve. They'll be involved in everything. The CIA will be involved in every movement that creates instability to regimes they don't like. We saw it in Chile, we saw it in many, many countries where the CIA intervene to make things easier for their own interests. But we can't focus our discussion around inter-imperialist rivalry. That's going to happen anyway. Turkey probably has the major interest at the moment in Syria. But in reality, Turkey is not going to take over Syria. Like, that's not a perspective. So Turkey has, for a long period of time, tried to create instability in Syria, and its support for its own groups, such as Matthew outlined, the Syrian army and stuff, and also support for HTS. That's going on because it serves Turkey's interest. But then at the same time, they're fighting against the Turkish Kurdish groups inside Syria at the present time. There's a conflict between the Syrian National Army and the Kurd-based groups. There'll always be that, but we have to kind of not put too much emphasis on that aspect, and instead to look at how we can unite class. The thing about Jelani as well, the Muslim Brotherhood is true, as Matthew explained, had a branch in Palestine, which was Hamas. And Hamas, we should remember, also emerged in the Second Intifada after the year 2000. In 1987, the Intifada was a mass movement of the entire population of Palestine rising up in largely peaceful movement, fighting against the Israeli regime, such that it caused them so much unease. That's where the Oslo Accords came from, as a way to buy off that movement. Then, arising after that movement, Israel then helped to fund, they accepted funding from Qatar to Hamas directly, because they thought by helping Hamas, they'd undermine the PLO and Arafat, whom they wanted to get rid of completely. So the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas then broke with them. No, not in their actions and so on. I'm not saying that Hamas is now a revolutionary socialist movement, nothing like that. But they drew up a second charter some years ago. The original charter was calling for, well, more or less, in summary, just the end of Israel, death to all Jews, all this kind of stuff. They moved away from that towards what they pretended to be a more progressive movement in more recent times. And their rule in Gaza before the recent events was a more open regime than the Muslim Brotherhood would have wished. That's true. The Muslim Brotherhood was banned in 1981 by Assad in Syria, because they saw the Muslim Brotherhood as opposition to them because of its Sunni base versus their minority Alawite. But the Muslim Brotherhood has worldwide ambitions, but by and large, its gains that it makes are pretty. I mean, for instance, in Egypt, they were driven out after the collapse of the Mubarak regime. They thought they could move in, but it didn't work. In Syria, they've always been problematic, and as I said, we're outlawed in Syria as far back as 1981. So we can put too much emphasis also on what groups stand for and say they stand for. The reason that Hamas moved away from the Muslim Brotherhood is because they were trying to gain support for their rule when they were ruling in Gaza. The reason Assad moved against the Brotherhood is to preserve his regime against the Sunnis in Syria. There's particular processes that go on anyway, irrespective of the toing and froing. And we need to be careful not to get bogged down with analysing too closely what people say they are and what their traditions do, and look instead what's happening on the ground. So the main thing on the ground now is that the population of Syria is on the move. That's number one. Assad has been overthrown, and people are looking around to see what's the next step. And the next step is the creation of a working class based movement around trade unions, community groups, working class communities, socialists, and there used to be a strong communist party in Syria. There was also a very left-wing movement in Lebanon, drawing together, and also, by the way, in Israel, there's a very strong communist party, drawing together the best traditions of socialism and what's described often as socialism led by the Communist Party, trade unions, community groups, working class communities, all drawn together around a common program for socialism and a federation of socialist states in the Middle East. Without such an approach, you can get bogged down in looking at what people say about themselves. They can change it overnight. Somebody could say tonight they're in favor of the restoration of the rule of Muhammad back in the 7th century, which a lot of the groups still call for. And then they drop that, and suddenly they're calling for the rights of women to not wear the scarf and all this kind of stuff. Depending on the forces on the ground, they change their position. That's been the history of working class struggle throughout the centuries. So we need to be focused more on that and less on the individual groups or imperialist rivalries or the cynical way in which imperialist powers, CIA and the rest of them intervene, or Mossad. Kind of look beyond that a bit and see if we can build something, along socialist lines across the Middle East.
All right, thank you very much, comrade. Does anybody else want to come in? Dominic?
Yeah, it's just a small point I want to make. But I think one of the big things that's come out of this is the fact that a dictator who ought to have an iron grip on a section of a country, if not the whole country, could do what the hell he liked. He had an army, an air force, and all the rest of it, and a crowd of blokes in trucks with small arms, no tanks, no planes, no nothing in that direction, could frighten him so much and show how naked he was in reality, how he could be easily overthrown in that situation. There were no major battles. There was no, anything of that nature of a war or anything. He had absolutely no support. Now, does that apply to other leaders in that area? Does that give courage to the people, to say, if the Syrians can do it, can we? There's all that side of things that I think is progressive about this overthrow, this dictatorship.
Yeah, thank you. Good point. Anybody else want to come in? Matthew, do you want to reply?
Yeah,
I don't know whether it's the final summing up or whether maybe it'll
I hope, if it provokes people a little more. Yeah, I mean, I think it's been useful. I mean, obviously the thing about, I think the other factor, of course, in Syria is the departure of at least 5 million refugees. Obviously as a result of the civil war. I think there's around about 3 million or more in Turkey, and then another million in Germany, and then of course another million scattered around all over the place. And that, of course, is then also going to be an issue, because obviously the Turks have been really quite keen to start expelling, for internal political reasons. I mean, to expel those Turkish, those Kurdish, the Syrian refugees. They're quite keen on expelling those guys. The same with obviously with the political situation in Germany. I mean, there's talk of trying to expel hundreds of thousands of Syrians, under the conditions of the rise of the far right. So in those terms, it then becomes a factor in both regionally, particularly in Turkey, and also in European terms. Obviously, the alliance of the imperialists with HTS and so on, and suddenly they turn around and start saying, well, these guys are okay anyway. We don't mind if they had a bounty on their heads, or they were down as being this and that. Now they're great. And the funny one is, of course, that Baerbock, as the Green foreign minister of Germany, turned up to visit al-Gulani or al-Sirah, and of course he wouldn't even shake a hand because she's a woman. It's just, I mean, it's bizarre, but there you are. But there's also, of course, the whole issue of the Palestinians over time. I mean, since at least 1967, none of the Arab regimes, and not just the Gulf, but none of the Arab regimes have done anything other than to betray the Palestinians systematically, and we can see this in the genocide. They have sat there. The population, of course, has immense sympathy the Palestinians. I mean, the population of Jordan is Palestinian. 60% of the population of Jordan is Palestinian. You know, it really goes to the very heart of these things. And of course, all these countries are bound together. You know, you cannot, for instance, separate Lebanon and Syria. They're bound together by history, by their common, the interrelation in terms of political forces, the fact that obviously the Lebanese civil war was largely solved by using the Syrian army, the fact that Hezbollah, of course, was a principal support for Assad. These things are all, the whole area is bound together, and the whole thing cannot be solved piece by piece. It's actually going to be solved in aggregate. I mean, the fact also, I think the other thing, of course, is the fact that, I mean, clearly the IDF has been defeated in Gaza. As a ground force, the IDF has been defeated in Gaza. It has failed to suppress the resistance, and is now having to go away, leaving that resistance with its weapons, etc., etc. And that's huge, and that's a historic thing, for that to happen. It does enormous damage to the Israeli regime state. So, and that, in those terms, that's going to have an effect. The problem also, I mean, it then obviously also relates to the whole issue, the whole political question. What's the political alternative? I mean, if you look at, say, the history of the Syrian Communist Party, it shattered into however many different bits, who wound up on different sides. Some bits of the Syrian Communist Party supported the regime, the Assad regime, to the end. Other bits of the Syrian Communist Party supported the opposition, and it just blew apart. The problem is, of course, obviously you don't have really a Trotskyist tradition at all in the Middle East. I mean, there's some tradition in Lebanon, and there was some tradition in Iran, but other than that, generally it's been Stalinist, it's been the left, and so then it becomes a question. Well, how do we actually build some kind of a decent tradition? I mean, the problem is, as people have said, I mean, in terms of the history of, say, Hamas actually was established with the assistance of the Israeli secret police, the Shin Bet. It's a known fact. I mean, it's written, but the point being that its military wing has now led the defeat in victory in Gaza. I mean, despite the fact, okay, the point being also that in Gaza you had effectively a united front. The various people have counted over a dozen different factions within the resistance in Gaza. So in those terms, it's then to say, well, okay, the collapse of Syria really is a facet of the development, but it will be then a regional issue as to how it is solved. And a political question: can anybody actually come up with a decent political program that says, okay, we're in favour of the rights of women, we're in favour of rights of religion, the practice of religion, of all religions and none, that we're in favour of democracy, that we're in favour of the common ownership of the means of production, because those are the only things that are actually going to solve the issue. I mean, none of the capitalist forces have that, or all of them are interested merely in chopping out bits, and it will become clearer what bits they want to chop out, why, and all the rest of it. But none of them actually have any interest in actually providing any kind of a decent condition for the people of Syria or the wider people. And we can see, as you say, the failure again in Lebanon. The fact that the imperialists have imposed a president. The president of Syria was, quote, elected with the presence of the envoys of the US of Saudi Arabia. Both of the US funds the Lebanese military, Saudi Arabia funds the Lebanese state, and the French as a former colonial power, and they imposed a president, an unconstitutional president, on Lebanon, principally actually as a means of suppressing Hezbollah. But you know, there's this desperation to put together these stitch-ups. And so that is the issue. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Matthew. Are there any other comrades who want to come in, or should we treat that as the summing up? Any comrade, there's time if comrades want to make a new contribution. Yes, Charles.
I don't know that we have much of a difference, Finn, on the international question. I just wanted to raise this in terms of not seeing the inter-imperialist rivalry as, I'm gonna put it a different way, to put it in the context of the inter-imperialist rivalry, because there is a tug of war over Turkey. I don't agree necessarily that Turkey is imperialist. That's maybe a whole nother discussion. I don't ascribe to the sub-imperialist theory. Obviously, it's a regional power and it has its hands in the pie. But Turkey is kind of being pulled towards BRICS on one side, towards EU on the other. And we just saw the pull away of Saudi Arabia towards the BRICS. And this whole realignment of forces between the emergent Russia-China imperialist bloc with the BRICS in tow as their semi-colonial base, and the United States and a declining United States and Europe trying to hold on to their piece of the pie is leading towards inter-imperialist war that we're facing, at least from the attitude of the working class to defeat our own imperialist monster at home. Is the task we're facing here with the new imperialist monster Trump coming in. I don't buy it that the ceasefire in Israel is going to hold, because I have no trust in Netanyahu to observe anything on paper or in his words. But I just wanted to put that in that context, because that's kind of how we see it in our international Leninist Trotskyist tendency is this unfolding both across Ukraine, across the Near East, Middle East, Southwest Asia, of the struggle of the working class to find its leadership and its agency in the face of the inter-imperialist battle for resources, and this whole layer of the left, which always points its finger and says, there's the CIA over there, there's the CIA. Yeah, the CIA is everywhere, but that doesn't take away from the agency of the masses. And I'll just close on that.
Yeah, thank you. Good point again, Charles. Does anybody else want to contribute?
I do think
Matthew?
there's a couple of things to say in reply to that. I think obviously, as you say, it's about the disintegration of the American empire, and we can see it falling apart. And that's what generates a lot of this in terms of the bits falling and so on, and the fact that obviously that it desperately attempts to preserve Israel as its key agent in holding control of the Middle East, and therefore that Biden has supplied everything he possibly could to Netanyahu to make that to run the genocide. And it's a defeat of the US as much as more so even, and Biden is at least as guilty as Netanyahu. The problem for Netanyahu is that has in many parts shattered his army. I mean, the problem is if you look back over the piece, an actual people, the leadership of the IDF has actually been pleading for this to stop for months because they can't take it. They just can't take it anymore. You know, people have been, even if you go back to the early part of last year, there was lists of people saying, look, officers of the IDF saying, we want to resign, we want out of this. The thing is that he's not capable. So in those terms, I mean, it creates a huge issue. And then, of course, I mean, obviously the whole nature of Israeli society, that it is in a condition of breakdown, and being shattered, people leaving, and all this sort of stuff. So all of that's got to play out as well. I think that, I mean, for in the case of Turkey, again, I mean, it's a profound internal crisis. I mean, the Turks, of course, their economy is in serious. It has a serious issue because obviously what the Turkish economy was the receipt of huge amounts of the money that was put out. I mean, what the US and others did through quantitative easing was to create huge amounts of money, which they gave to the ruling class. And the ruling class invested in places like Turkey because they could make more money at it. So it actually, in those terms, it kept the Turkish economy afloat. Now the thing is, once you get a position where the Federal Reserve says, no, we're starting to put interest rates up again, everybody sucks all that money back out of the likes of Turkey, and the Turkish economy is on its back. And this is the problem that, the likes of, the whole thing, the mechanism starts breaking down. The likes of Erdogan, I mean, he's in serious trouble again. And the thing is, okay, well, politically, what they then say, well, okay, well, obviously the issue is these Syrian refugees. It's not the fact the economy is collapsing because the capitalists are moving their money out of the place. It's the Syrian refugees, and you try and stir up racism, and it's the Kurds and all the rest of it. And of course, you can then use things like the Turks that have used the Takfiris internally to attack the left. I mean, some of the left. There was a left demonstration some years ago. It was actually in which there was a suicide bomb. Precisely, those people were used by the regime in order to attack the left. So I mean, all of that is in there, and it's multifaceted. But it's about the disintegration of the system, but the question is, what's the alternative? Can anybody put forward a coherent alternative under those conditions?
Okay, Charles, your hand is up. Is that a legacy hand, or do you want to come back?
Legacy hand. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Are there any comrades who haven't spoken who would like to speak? Just it could be for a small point or to ask a question, or if not, I'd just say, I mean, I think it's been an absolutely brilliant discussion. I've learned a lot from it. I'd like to read actually what one of our comrades here posted to me. That's Comrade Joe Duffy from Ireland. He sent me a message which I'm going to read out. Excellent inputs by all comrades. It's whetted my appetite to learn more about Syria. Thank you to all for your research and contributions. I've nothing of any particular interest to add. The situation is very, very complex and will be developing for a long while. And of course, I completely endorse those comments. Right, if nobody wants a last word, Matthew, do you?
No, I think we've covered most of the things. Obviously things are very fluid. So I mean, everything could change next week.
Okay, I'd just like to let you know about next week's meeting. The whole region is like a bubbling cauldron, and obviously what's foremost at the moment is the so-called peace agreement, or what do we call it, the truce between Israel and Hamas. And that also, I mean, there are so many issues arising from that, and these are all interconnected. The situation in the whole region. So we are hoping to get an expert from Israel and or Palestine to speak. We're still looking for a speaker, but we have several very appealing options, and you'll be getting a notice, of course, as usual, via the email, which will go out in a few days' time. So I look forward to seeing everybody there. Thank you, all of you, for your contributions, and see you next week. Thanks, comrades.